And so we are in Genesis. This is our last week in Genesis, and we're going to be looking at the theme of covenant. Have you guys have a happy Valentine's Day? Oh, you guys are real romantic. Great. Nothing. Okay. So Chelsea and I, my wife, we don't really celebrate Valentine's Day, but we just kind of get each other a treat, just kind of like a, I don't know. So I got Chelsea some what? I can't remember the word. Oh man, I'm a great husband, you can tell. Macarons, oh my gosh, it's French, guys, it's not English, that's why. Oh no. Right, so I got her some macarons from this store down the street, and she got me, because she knows me so well, she got me a box of Cinnamon Life and real milk. I'm highlighting the real milk part because there's no dairy allowed in our house. My wife is the Whole30 queen, so there's no dairy. So it was absolutely amazing to enjoy a bowl of cereal without almond milk or cashew milk or whatever. That was so good. It was so good. I have some really bad news for all of you cereal lovers, though. I know you're going to be extremely depressed when I tell you this. Cereal sales are plummeting. You guys feel the intensity of that this morning, right? Extremely depressing. So the cereal industry is a $10 billion industry. It's massive. They've lost about 30% of their sales over the past few years. And this is why. Almost 40% of millennials, this is from a 2015 report, says cereal was an inconvenient breakfast choice because they had to clean up after eating it. Oh, man. Okay. I will confess to you, I am a part of this generation, this millennial generation, and I've never been so sad to be a part of the millennial generation. Okay, let's think about it. When we have a bowl of cereal, what do we clean? It's a bowl and a spoon. Like, this isn't extravagant breakfast. This isn't like pancakes with mixing and all of these kinds of things. This is crazy. This is crazy, right? Because if you're a cereal maker, one truth will haunt you forever. Eating means using a bowl, and bowls don't clean themselves. It's absolutely terrible. But what's going on here is that we live in the age of convenience, don't we? We like to make fun of millennials for it, but I would like to say that I'm not a part of the generation that made the peanut butter and jelly in one can, right? I wasn't part of that generation. Like, we can't be using so many knives and opening all those jars. But if anything, I guess we could say that. But what's happening is we have this modern technology that gives us every single thing at our fingertips, right? I can open Google and answer any question that I have in an instant, in a few seconds, be given all this type of information that I've never had access to before. And this modern flow of humanity has rapidly shaped the way we view everything, including our beloved breakfast cereal. If it costs too much time, if it costs too much effort, if there's too much commitment, it's probably not worth it. All right, if we need a ride, we call Lyft. If we want food, we call Uber Eats. If we need something, we open up Amazon and get it the next day or the next 2 days with Amazon Prime. Modern technology at this moment is astounding, and it's so helpful. Being able to find a book on Amazon and have it to you the next day is by far amazing. But there is a real cost I think we haven't really taken into account. And that real cost is relationships. See, no more are we willing to wash our bowl for breakfast in the morning than we are willing to be in friendship or marriage that is uncomfortable. We have an app for that, right? You just swipe left or right. You guys know what app I'm talking about? I haven't been on it, but I know who you are. You guys have been on it. No, it doesn't look good left. If it looks good right. It's just this complete, immediate satisfaction that we gain in relationships. Or to be in a relationship with our kin who is at times difficult. We have a solution for all relationship problems. It's called the unfollow button on Facebook. Now I don't ever have to read your nonsense again. Let alone love and serve someone who shows up on a Sunday who at times can be incorrigible. There are so many barriers that we get to enjoy that separate us from intimacy and deep friendship with one another. The real loser in this age of convenience is not General Mills, but the community of God. The Bible has a standard, though, that is impeccable and beautiful when it talks about relationships. And this word can be summed up with one word. It's called covenant. And this word covenant comes from a Latin word called convenire, which means the coming together. It's like two parties coming together to make a contract or an agreement on certain promises, stipulations, or responsibilities. This is what we would call like a bond between one another. This covenant shows up in a lot of places over the Old Testament. One of them is a covenant between kings, and this has some political implications. So King Solomon made a covenant or a treaty with King Hiram of Tyre, and this brought this political benefits. They were going to fight each other. They were going to be in alliance and relationship with one another. One of them that I loved was between David and his best friend Jonathan. And I want to read this verse to you, and I want you to feel just the impact of what this means for their relationship. In 1 Samuel, it says this, "And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself." Oh, it's so good. And the next following verses, it illustrates Jonathan taking off his robe and giving it to David, taking his armor and his sword and putting it and equipping David with his own things. At one point, Jonathan's father, who was King Saul was trying to kill David, and Jonathan talked his dad down and kept David safe. And I know this language isn't normal for us, covenant. Like if I went up to one of my best friends and be like, "Hey, brother, we have a covenant together because I love you as myself," he'd kind of look at me and say, "You're weird, we're no longer friends," right? That's kind of how it would go. See, men, we like to use prehistoric grunts to express our feelings. Just kind of, and then we get it, right? But in its uniqueness, I think we can identify like the loveliness involved in Jonathan's relationship with David. It's something that we would call beautiful. It's this commitment between them. Jonathan was committed to love his best friend, not because there was some kind of benefit from it. This was before David was king, so he was just a lowly shepherd boy when Jonathan goes in a relationship with him. But this was a moment where he identifies, "I love you," and they enter into this relationship. We probably hear the word covenant thrown mostly at marriages though, right? Can you guys agree with me? We hear covenant at marriages because the word covenant so beautifully displays what marriage really is. So I officiated a wedding yesterday. It's super fun. I'm like a hopeless romantic. So weddings are just like my favorite. Like the bride, doesn't matter who it is, if I know them or not. When that bride starts coming down, I look over at the groom and he's just kind of like about to pass out because he's just like so excited and stressed at the same time. I love that moment. Okay, that sounded really bad. I don't want the groom to pass out, but it's just a beautiful moment. Like they lock eyes and they're just committed to it. This is the moment when they profess publicly that they are going to do life together. It's so good. Devoting to faithfulness and the good of the others. But there's a legal standing to this, right? After the wedding ceremony, we have to sign a marriage contract, and that goes to the county. But the marriage isn't based off of that contract, right? That contract just signifies what's happening in that ceremony and creates protections for the both of them as it pertains to the state. But I wanted to share with you the vows that they decided to say together because this beautifully displays what covenant is. Are you ready? "I love you as I love no other." You hear that language from Jonathan in 1 Samuel. "All that I am, I share with you. Through health and sickness, through plenty and want, through joy and sorrow, now and forevermore." And as they said those words, they were committing their lives to one another. And I want to be clear, though, because this is important for us to understand, covenant is not just exclusively for marriage. And I wanted to show that to you. It's in friendships, it's in politics, it's everywhere. But the word covenant is this rich and deep word. But our fullest understanding of covenant comes when we see how God interacts with his people, with us. And God covenants with his people. So we're going to take a snapshot of our understanding of what the covenant is, specifically as revealed in Genesis. So if you have a Bible with you, why don't you open it up to Genesis chapter 6. We're going to be kind of roaming around Genesis, but we're going to be here for most of the time. I think it could be argued that the theme of covenant starts in the garden with Adam and Eve, even though there's no explicit mention of the covenant in the garden. But it's this place with stipulations. There's this covenant relationship being involved with God and his creation. But the first time that it shows up explicitly is with Noah. John talked about this last week, and just this, what humanity had looked like. It just had gone so far away from what God had intended for creation. In chapter 6, verse 11, it says that the earth was so corrupt and it was so full of violence that God saw the people and the earth and their corrupted ways and decided to bring a flood to wipe it off the face of the earth. I mean, that's where humanity is at this moment. Like every step they've had to take, that they've taken, they've had an opportunity to follow God or step into evil. They've stepped all the way into evil. And it's just full of violence and broken relationships and pain and suffering and murder and strife. All of those things, of course, not that God had never intended for his people to undergo. And at this moment, this is when God steps in and initiates covenant. Do you see when God does, do you see like the importance of when God does this? So in chapter 6, verse 18, God has this conversation with Noah. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. So in this moment, God enters into this relationship with Noah, and it brings protection. Noah and his family, and as we know the Sunday school story, the two of each kind get on the boat and they're rescued from destruction. This covenant relationship is what preserves Noah and saves him from the flood. And the rainbow then symbolizes not necessarily just a promise, but this beautiful covenant relationship that was established between the creator of all things and this one lowly human. I get a crack up though, but it's no wonder the double rainbow guy was so pumped, right? When he saw the double rainbow, when you just take into account all that covenant means. If you don't know double rainbow, it's the age of convenience, remember? Just Google it after the service, you'll be all right. Next we see Abram. So Noah is like the first covenant keeper, and then we move on to Abram. And God establishes this everlasting covenant with Abram. So God comes to Abram in a vision and gets swept up as God meets Abram on earth. I love the story and the imagery that happens in this passage. So in chapter 15 through 17 kind of illustrates this whole idea. But God takes Abram outside and he says, Abram, look at the stars. Can you count them? That's how many your descendants and your offspring will be. I mean, it's incredible to think about. I mean, just going out and looking at the stars, it's almost like it fills you with anxiety if you had to count all of those, because there's so many, it's innumerable. There's no way you could count all of them. But God promises Abraham, that's how many your descendants will be. And God promises an heir and many descendants in land. So we pick up in chapter 15, verse 18. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants, I give this land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river of the Euphrates. I mean, you think about this for Abram must have been incredibly life-changing. So God calls him out of this land and says, I have this portion, this promised land for you and all of your descendants. You will be successful. You will be fruitful. You're going to reign on this earth as I had intended from the garden. And then two chapters later, God reiterates this again. In chapter 17, verses 1 through 2. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. And the chapter would go on in chapter 17, and God would promise a bunch of things in this covenant. God would promise his presence with Abraham. That God would be with him and walk with him in this life. Abraham is assured a rich future. God's like, look, you're going to be in slavery for almost 400 years, but you're going to come out looking so good. I'm going to bless you in that. There's going to be many descendants for you. There's going to be a place to live and serve in the midst of the nations. And then God says, I will protect you from your enemies. I mean, this is the basis of God's relationship with Abram. He's establishing this covenant relationship, and it's so good. And I want you to see this. This is a major thread, not only throughout the Old Testament, but through the New Testament. So Moses in Israel at Mount Sinai, which we'll look at in a few weeks as we dig into Exodus, God establishes his covenant again with Moses and gives further guidelines for what the covenant should look like and calls them that they would become a holy people. They would become the children of God in this covenant. Later on, King David was promised a divine son who would rule and reign forever as the shepherd king. And all along this way, God is meeting his people and continually revealing what the covenant is and building upon what it was before. What I want to do is just say a few things about covenant and what it says about God. Because I think for us in this modern cultural moment, it's really hard for us to kind of capture that word covenant because we don't use it in our normal speech. It's not a normal thing to do unless we're at a wedding. So a few things. The first thing is this. What does the covenant say about God? The covenant says that God is the initiatory person. He's the one that follows it, and he's the one that pursues humans. So God begins the covenant out of his devotion toward humanity. No, you notice in the story in chapter 6, Noah didn't cry out to God. Right? There was no moment when Noah said, Lord, this earth is terrible. Can you save us? Can you help us? No, it is God who initiates relationship with Noah. Abram, in the same way, didn't seek God to bless his family, but God desired to be with Abram. And so God covenants with Abram and promises all of these amazing things. So I want you to hear that this morning. Wherever you are, God is the one who initiates. He's pursuing you. He's looking for relationship and deep and values you so much. It is a God who initiates covenants. The second thing is this: God wants to bring intervention. The covenant becomes the initiation of God's restoring initiative. Do you remember when God shows up in Noah in the story of humanity? It's when everything goes terribly wrong. After the fall in Genesis 3, after all of creation has decided to fall away from God, then God intervenes and says, look, this is your way back to me. This is your way back to blessing. And God's covenant purpose was to choose a people in and through whom the world would be healed. Not just a specific group of people, but that the whole world would be restored back to what God had intended. We get a glimpse of this in the story of God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis 18. It says this: Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation. Listen, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. See, from the wreckage of fall, which led humanity into violence and evil, God was desiring to bring us back to a place of renewal, and he was using covenant as a tool to do that. Where humans and all of creation in the world would be in a right place before God, and the whole world would be blessed through the covenant community that God has established. I don't know about you, but I often think about covenant in a very personal way. So covenant for me is just my relationship with God. But God, even in the Old Testament with Abram, was saying, this is not just for you. This is where it starts. This is where you're changed and transformed. But through you, I will bring blessing to all of the world. This covenant is for the restoration of all things. The third thing, is that God obligates himself to Abraham. And this is a very peculiar thing that God would do. In the story about the covenant with Abram, there's this weird transaction that happens in chapter 15. And I want to read you just a piece of it. It says this: so the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut. The birds of prey came down in the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. This is not like a PETA passage, all right? This is, if you love animals, I'm sorry about this passage, right? But what's happening? God says, go get these animals, and Abram cuts them in half and puts them on opposite sides. Like there's this lane or highway to walk between the animals that are cut in half. And then Abram is put into a deep sleep, and what happens? In verse 17, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fiery pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. See what's happening here is God in this moment is taking on the full responsibility of the covenant himself. Typically, you would have both parties walk through this. And the animals that were cut into two pieces was like a symbol. If you break this covenant, you shall be like these animals. It says that in Jeremiah. For those who violate the covenant and not fulfill the terms, I will treat like the calf they cut in two. So it's like a visual reminder. If you break this covenant, this should be your end, cut in two. And Abram is on the side. God puts him into a deep sleep. And it's God himself in this image of the torch who walks through the animals cut themselves. And he says, I obligate myself to Abram and humanity and all of creation. It is now God's responsibility to bring the means and the end of the covenant. It's so full of grace. I love what this commentator said. He says, God's responsibility is promise and performance. Humankind's responsibility is belief. The covenant is so saturated in grace because it is a God who obligated himself, not humans who obligated themselves to God. See, God stooped down and obligated himself to the outcomes of human decision. God promises to be the faithful one. Regardless of how bad Abraham, David, or even you and me would be, or how we choose to be, God will remain in his covenant with us. That is a beautiful promise for us this morning. The last thing that it tells us is that God is patient. All throughout Genesis, there was a process of revelation as God taught himself to these covenant bearers with Noah and with Abram. So God always elects a person and calls them out to be blameless and live before him. But I want you to see this in Abraham. So God meets Abraham and promises him descendants in chapter 15, right? This beautiful display, like Abram, go outside, look up at the stars. That's how many descendants you'll have. And what does Abram do in chapter 16? He goes and sleeps with his wife's servant. He's like, okay, well, my wife's too old, so obviously, Lord, that's not how you're going to do it. So Abram does. He goes on and finds his own way and has a son, Ishmael. And in chapter 17, God reiterates the covenant. No, Abram, that's not how it's going to happen. Your descendants are going to be numerous in the stars, but it's going to be my way through your wife, Sarah. And in this moment, Abram falls on his face laughing before God. He's like, Abram's like, Lord, you're going to bring that through the two old hags you see before you? Are you kidding me? And he falls before God laughing. He thinks it's a joke. And what's revealed through the covenant is God has this divine patience with humanity. And he slowly reveals his intention for the covenant keepers. And as God reveals more of himself, the deeper he calls us into that covenant with him. As he starts with Noah, there's no stipulations. He's like, build the boat, save yourselves. But then with Abraham, he begins to reveal himself. There's no stipulations. But the second time he reveals himself to Abraham, there begin this language of walk before me, be blameless. And you see God changing Abram's name from Abram to Abraham. You see this circumcision as this sign of renewal and covenant between God's people. I can imagine, as the prophets would do later, it must have been so frustrating to see God's patience with his people and this progressive revelation of who God is. So God takes his people step by step. He doesn't all of a sudden show up to Noah and say, you have to be perfect and blameless. It's this progression of steps, and God is calling his people deeper into relationship, into covenants. The prophets, though, were the watchdogs of God's people. They were revealing the truth of God. They were correcting God's people. And I can imagine it like just being a front row seat of seeing God's people continually turn away from him. And the prophets had a front row seat of what God had desired and the people's inability. And that's why Jeremiah was the weeping prophet. You guys heard that before? He's just like, you can just imagine him like, oh my gosh, like Israel's doing it again. Are you serious, right? Like he knew exactly what God had promised for his people. And he so deeply wanted his people to accept God's way, but they continually turned away. And there was this moment when God had revealed to Jeremiah that there would be a day when we would covenant or relate with God in a new way. There's this prophetic vision in Jeremiah chapter 31, as Jeremiah would proclaim this: the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. He continues in verse 33. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. What you see happening is this through line or this thread throughout the Bible that exclaims this covenant that God has created for his people. Oftentimes, though, our language around this is not helpful. This is my caveman way of describing it. You ready? Old bad, new good. You guys feel that? This is the way we describe the Old Testament and the New Testament. This is the way we describe the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. But instead, I want you to reframe the covenant in this way. You hearing me? You with me? The covenant builds progressively upon itself, which forms the backbone to the redemptive story of God throughout the entirety of the Bible. I want you to think about this. All throughout Scripture, God is continually revealing himself to his people. Look, this is what I want you to be. This is what I want you to look like, because through you I will restore all things. And when we think this way, instead of just saying the Old Testament is dumb, it's bad, I don't like that God, and the New Testament God seems so much more happy and nice, right? This unlocks our understanding to see Jesus correctly. If you don't like the Old Testament and its description of the covenant, then you really are not going to fully know Jesus and who he claims to be. Jesus quotes the Old Testament all the time. And instead of the old being bad, we don't need to really read it anymore. I mean, we don't need to stay there for very much longer. We see the covenant as this beautiful redemptive story being capitulated over and over in our own story as God reached down and obligates himself to humans. And as Jesus stood up and declared before his disciples in Luke chapter 22, and he took the bread, gave thanks, and broke it. I want you to hear this language. And gave it to them, saying, this is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Are you ready for this? In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying what? This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. And I can imagine in this moment, the disciples kind of just hit with intensity as their mind goes back to Genesis all the way through the Old Testament. And that language of the covenant is bring up in their minds, and they're saying, this is the one Jeremiah was talking about. This is the covenant which God had always dreamed of bringing into our community. This is the relationship God had intended for us from the beginning. This is it. Jesus is the climax of that covenant that we find in the Old Testament. The new covenant that Jesus represents is the culmination of God's saving work to the world. Christ himself is the New Testament covenant. And the New Testament reveals Jesus as the son of Abraham who trusted his father even to death. Listen, he's the only perfect, obedient Israelite who kept and fulfilled the law of God. He's the royal son promised to David who inaugurated God's kingdom in his life, death, and resurrection, and now reigns forever at God's right hand. See, Jesus perfectly succeeded at every human failure all throughout the covenant. And Jesus becomes the perfect covenant keeper that Abram, Moses, and David could never be. And as the author of Hebrews would exclaim, this makes Jesus the guarantor or the mediator of the new and better covenants. And there's some rich theology here, and I understand we're kind of taking a bird's eye view, but spend some time in Hebrews chapter 6 through 9 and read how this author sees Jesus. I mean, Hebrews is kind of a riff off the Old Testament and viewing Jesus in light of the Old Covenants. But the cross becomes the ultimate revelation of God covenanting with humanity. That those who would believe in Jesus' death and resurrection would forever be saved and promised a bold and amazing future where there is justice for all wrongdoing and the world becomes God's dwelling place once again. Christ in this new covenant then invites his people to follow him and join him in this new partnership. See, what I love about this morning is we get to partake in the Lord's table. And this is not just a somber reflection on our sin, our guilt, and our shame, but it's a celebration together as a covenant community of what Jesus did on our behalf. We get to do that together as a family. And the Eucharist articulates this intimacy between God and humans, that God would be willing to stoop and pursue his wayward creation and love on them and bring them and be patient enough to bring them along a process to reveal himself more fully. In this age of the internet, this age of convenience, we've relegated relationships to a very small place in our lives. I mean, it comes to the point where I could do this. I could open my phone. I'm doing it for you right now. I could go to Instagram. I could search Zach's name, and we're no longer friends, right? I mean, that's kind of how we view, that's relationships right now, right? It's okay, I didn't do it, I promise. We're still friends, Zach. But I unfollowed you, so I don't have to see your stuff. Your loss, that's great. Oh, man. What I want us to see this morning, though, is the inspiration that God's covenant with his people that should draw us to covenant with each other. I mean, the way that we frame covenant this morning, the way that we see God all throughout the history, thousands of years ago, culminating in the cross of Jesus, reveals that God is a loving and patient God who wants to restore humanity and bring us into right relationship with himself, where we can worship God, where we can be free from shame and guilt, where your brokenness and your baggage that you wheeled in this morning from your life Monday through Saturday is no longer a real thing because your identity is in Jesus. I mean, that's where God wants to take his people. But we have to be willing to move from a community of convenience to a covenant community. From convenience to covenant. And this is a hard thing to do. But not only a people in covenant with a patient God, but people in covenant with one another. I want you to look to your right and left. That means those people next to you. Yeah, you're vowing commitment. You're vowing covenant. You're vowing a bond with those people. But what does it look like for a community to be marked by the unbreakable values of the covenant? I have just a few things. For one, the covenant community is going to be an intervening community. And what that means is when you're walking in your job, at the grocery store, if you're walking your dog around your block, when you see injustice, God calls you to step in and bring justice. Wherever it is. For the one who's far from God, to reveal the righteousness of Jesus to that person. When someone's getting backstabbed, to step in and bring forgiveness and love and healing and hope. When someone's stealing, to step in and bring righteousness and those. God is calling you to intervene and bring justice in those spaces that you dwell every day. I understand this word justice has gained so much popularity in the Christian community to just mean social justice, and there's this big controversy around the word. But I want to tell you this. If God intervened in creation to bring his justice, to covenant with his people, then he's also calling his covenant people to intervene in this world and bring justice too. The second thing is this, to be patient. Oh, to be patient. Maybe we should get that as a tattoo instead of like some hip anchor or like Jeremiah 29 or something. Just get patient on our body. That's not hip, is it? It's not very hip. Maybe if we got it in like Latin, it'd be really cool, across our chest or something. But patient, I want you to hear this. Patience means to bear the unbearable characteristics of people around you in the hopes that your relationship with them will bring them to transformation to Jesus. It's not a cut and run. It's not a fight or flight. What God is calling you to do is to say this. I want you to hear this. God is saying that he wants you to pursue people in this way. I love you now the same as I would if you followed Jesus. To commit ourselves to one another. I love you now as much as I would as if you didn't lie to me. I love you now as much as I would if you didn't backstab me or gossip about me or steal from me. That's God's commitment that he's given to us and called us to commit ourselves in the same way to one another. To allow people to belong in the community of God even before they believe. And the last thing is this. God's calling you to obligate yourself to one another out of love. I don't know, when you walk in, you saw the ropes. Those are like our covenant rules for you. Like you can't sit in the back, right? Those are our covenant stipulations. Not that we want to force you in the front, but we want you to be dependent on one another. We want you to obligate yourselves to one another, even in a physical space, to where you would want to sit with one another, where you'd want to hear how each other's life is going. And I want you to hear this, that we would be okay with conflict and discomfort. That we would obligate ourselves on a deeper level in covenant. That when someone brings conflict into the relationship, we wouldn't run but offer ourselves their ear to listen, to work things through. That in discomfort, we wouldn't hide away and stay in our homes, but in discomfort, we would push for peace. And that those relationships would then define the community of God. I'm going to call the band forward. And what I want you to hear this morning is not just a bunch of new rules for us to apply to our lives, but I want you to hear an inspiration from the way that God covenanted with us and how he's calling us to be a covenant community. How he's calling us out from ourselves to each other. How he's calling us out from our sin to righteousness, and how he's calling us to be the blessing of him throughout the world. That through us, people would see Jesus. That through us, that we would be the hands and feet of Jesus, bringing the message of blessing and peace to a world that needs it. Moving from a community of convenience to a community of the covenants. We're going to do one more thing as we close. I'm going to have you stand up if you're willing, if you're able. And what I want to do is I want us to give all of us an opportunity to practice what it means to be a covenant people. Because look, it is, don't get me wrong, I love being the center of the stage and teaching all this. And like, I love that you're all staring at me for like 40 minutes. It's the greatest thing ever, right? But nothing's going to happen if we just sit and never participate in what God is calling us to do. And so this morning, if you feel comfortable, I would just love for you to close your eyes and practice together with me forgiveness. As a first step as this covenant community stepping into the way of Jesus and not our own ways. So let's do this. I'm gonna have you close your eyes, and we're just gonna pray a blessing over those people that need forgiveness, and I'm just gonna walk us through what it looks like to forgive those who are around us. So if you feel comfortable, I'd love for you to close your eyes and bow your head. If you don't, if you're new here and this is kind of weird, you can check out for now, and you can join us again when you feel right. But let's do this. Let's practice forgiveness together. Gracious God, because I have been forgiven of so much, would you bring to mind someone that I need to forgive this morning? Did someone say something that was hurtful? Did someone do or act in a way that was harmful? Lord, who do I need to forgive today? God, with their face in mind, I forgive them. Help me to let it go. I release them. I set them free from my resentment and bitterness. And by the power and grace of your Son, Jesus Christ, I forgive them. I would ask everyone here this morning, could you just pray a blessing in the quiet of your heart over that person that's in your mind right now? Lord, your covenant is an inspiration to your people. Lord, I pray a blessing over this covenant community, this family that's here, Lord, that we would participate in your ways. As you've covenanted with us, as you've pursued us and brought us healing and wholeness, as you have intervened and brought justice in our lives, Lord, I pray that you would inspire us to do the same with those people who are to our right and our left, to those people who are at our workspace, who are at the grocery store, that we would be the blessing of the world because we've been redeemed by your Son. Lord, we give up our resentment and bitterness to you because you have forgiven us of great things. Lord, as you have pardoned us, we pardon those around us. As we have received from you, we give freely to those around us. And we ask, Lord, as we respond to you in worship through music, that you continue to move in our hearts and reveal to us the ways that we need to covenant with you and covenant with those who are around us. And it's your Son's name we pray. Amen.